After World War II, a monumental series of events began unfolding in Africa. Driven by independence movements and a changing world order with the US in front, European empires began leaving the continent. Between 1945 and 1980, 48 African nations won their independence, transforming the continent from a block of European colonies into a group of new independent nations. However, African governments soon faced a pressing issue. To kickstart economic growth, they desperately needed new infrastructure investments, and as a result, a source of funds to get them off the ground. For several decades, though, the only major choice was Western financial institutions, such as the World Bank. However, limited funds and the requirement of detailed, costly reports showing exactly when, where, and who funds would go to made this a burdensome and inadequate source. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, an astounding transformation was occurring in China. Fueled by a series of economic reforms, starting in the late 1970s, China began a period of immense economic growth. Along with it, Chinese infrastructure boomed, transforming the country from a largely agrarian state into an industrialized global power. Eventually, though, return on investment for new projects decreased as China transitioned from a developing to a developed country. With new riches and slowing domestic growth, China naturally began looking outwards for new investment opportunities. Chinese-African economic cooperation goes back decades. Between 1970 and 1975, the Chinese government financed and built the Tazara Railway, a $3 billion rail line from Kapiri-Mposhi in Zambia to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, on a 40-year interest-free loan. At the time, it was China's single largest foreign aid project, helping spark a friendly and cooperative relationship between Beijing and the region. With this foundation in place, as China began looking outwards for foreign investment opportunities, Africa, with its roughly $100 billion annual infrastructure gap, was a perfect match. Supply met demand. African nations would receive the funding they long needed to accelerate growth, and by earning interest on the loans, China would take a share of the rewards. As a result, starting in the early 2000s, a list of Chinese-financed infrastructure projects took off across Africa. Between 2001 and 2018, China loaned approximately $126 billion to African countries, funding numerous large-scale infrastructure megaprojects. In Ethiopia and Kenya, the state-owned Exim Bank of China loaned $2.5 and $3.2 billion to finance railways between Mombasa and Nairobi, and Addis Ababa and Djibouti. In Nigeria and Angola, it is now loaning $4.8 and $4.1 billion to finance the Mambilla and Kakulo Kabaka hydroelectric power stations. And as of 2022, Chinese and Algerian companies are planning to jointly finance and operate a new $7 billion phosphate plant in Algeria. Aside from these big-name projects, China has and is loaning money for countless smaller projects throughout the continent, including power plants, mines, rail lines, ports, and dams. As of 2020, 31% of all construction projects in Africa valued $50 million or more were Chinese-financed. In addition to loaning money, China has begun investing deeply in the region. Between 2001 and 2018, it invested $41 billion in African companies and assets, and many of its own private companies have begun operations in the continent. As of 2022, it is estimated there are over 10,000 Chinese-operated companies active in Africa. This integration has led to a massive increase in trade. In 2021, China exchanged $254 billion worth of goods with Africa, making it its largest trade partner by far. This development is crucial to China's future success. With a more affluent and rapidly aging population, it is quickly losing its role as the low-cost manufacturing option. It is transforming from the world's factory to its largest consumer market. To obtain its own source of cheap foreign labor, China is looking to Africa as many Western nations looked to itself just several decades ago. In addition, Africa has a plentiful supply of natural resources that China can help capitalize on to fuel its economy. With all these incentives, it is no surprise that China has taken an active role in the continent. It is an important part of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, a global strategy to invest in infrastructure in over 100 developing countries. Before we continue, let me introduce this video's sponsor, World of Tanks. World of Tanks is an award-winning online multiplayer action game where you take control of a tank and battle against other players around the world in intense tank-to-tank combat. In it, you can choose from over 600 tanks, including destroyers, artillery, light, medium, and heavy tanks. With over 40 arenas, you can drive your tank across open fields and deserts, climb steep hills, sneak through forests, and charge through urban areas. The game is historically accurate, with authentic models and vehicles that make you feel like you're in a real tank. You can also modify and upgrade your tank into a steel beast ready for any challenge. The game is free to play and has over 100 million players worldwide. To download the game, click the link in the description and use code TANKMANIA to win a free 7-day premium account, 250,000 credits, the premium tank Excelsior, and 3 rental tanks for 10 games each. Now, back to the video. Over the past 20 years, a sweeping political shift has taken place in Africa. As economic ties have strengthened with China, African countries have become more politically aligned with the Asian giant. In 2018, a total of 51 African leaders attended the annual Summit on Chinese-African Cooperation in Beijing, while only 27 attended the UN General Assembly. Not only has China provided economic assistance, it is making clear efforts to win allies in the region. In 2012, it opened a new $200 million headquarters for the African Union in Addis Ababa, paid for entirely by the Chinese government. In 2018, it granted $32 million to the Economic Community of West African States to build a new headquarters in Abuja, Nigeria. And in 2022, it has pledged to donate 600 million coronavirus vaccines to the continent and is about to open a new gifted parliament building for Zimbabwe. During a time when few countries are investing in Africa, China has remained consistent, and it has not gone unnoticed. According to a 2022 poll, 76% of young Africans listed China as having a positive influence on their lives, compared to 72% for the US. This is good news for China. With allies in Africa, it is more likely to receive support, or at least silence, regarding its political and military pursuits, including its expansive claims in the South China Sea and Taiwan. While Beijing likes to depict itself as a kind and cooperative ally to Africa, things are not always the same on the ground. For many African nations who pride themselves on their independence and anti-colonial past, the projects have brought in Chinese management, who have punished and segregated their African employees and locals, contributing to an atmosphere of Chinese neocolonialism. In addition, many Chinese-backed projects have not lived up to their expectations. With both sides rushing to get construction underway, critical due diligence has frequently been left by the wayside. This has led to projects that seemed great on paper, but have not fulfilled their expectations. Furthermore, Chinese activity has been linked with increases in corruption. Beijing has not hesitated to funnel millions of dollars into politicians' hands, and according to a 2017 report from McKinsey, 60 to 87% of Chinese firms have paid bribes to obtain licenses in Africa. Lastly, some of these projects have placed huge amounts of debt on the receiving nations, striking fears that China is implementing a strategy called debt trap diplomacy. In this strategy, a country will lend money to poorer nations, intentionally overwhelming them with unsustainable debt. With no other option, the poor nation is then forced to hand over strategic assets or political leverage to the lending nation. In Sri Lanka, the Hambantota International Port is frequently used as an example. Between 2007 and 2012, China's Exim Bank loaned Sri Lanka $1.1 billion to construct the port. However, with lower than expected traffic, in 2017, Sri Lanka signed a deal with China Merchant Port Holdings to hand over a 70% stake of the port on a 99-year lease in exchange for $1.1 billion. However, labeling this debt trap diplomacy is misleading. Sri Lanka was not forced to hand over the port, and no debt was forgiven. For most projects, Chinese banks have been willing to restructure the terms on existing loans rather than seizing physical assets. In addition, research has shown that China is generally transparent with its deals and does not target countries that will likely default on their debt. Despite a lack of evidence for debt trap diplomacy, Chinese influence in the African continent has given rise to Western anxieties. To counter Chinese influence, the EU and US have announced their own global infrastructure development programs. In June 2021, the US announced its Build Back Better World initiative, a plan to accelerate private investment from the US for infrastructure in low and middle-income countries. And in November 2021, the EU launched the Global Gateway, a plan to invest up to 300 billion euros in global infrastructure by 2027. Africa is welcoming these initiatives. All around the continent, its leaders have expressed that they do not care who provides the funds, just that they get them. Over the coming decades, Africa will certainly serve as a global arena between China and Western nations, with both sides seeking to gain allies and increase their global influence. Hopefully, the competition will result in beneficial infrastructure projects being built throughout Africa, leading to quick and stable economic growth, finally allowing Africa to unlock its true potential.